Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to talk about a subject which might seem quite obvious at first, but I think it's actually a little bit more subtle than you might initially think, and that's how to get the most out of your artillery. Now broadly there are two types of artillery in Napoleonic Black Powder. You've got foot artillery. Those tend to be heavier guns, possibly 9 or maybe even 12, or if you're Russian, 20 pounders. And you've also got horse artillery as well. Those cover smaller guns, maybe 3, perhaps 6 pounders, and those would be used to escort the cavalry. There is a third type of artillery, and we'll quickly touch on those, and that is the regimental guns. Now, only certain armies use these. They were very popular in the early periods, things like the 7 Years' War, the War of the Spanish Succession, maybe less so then. I'm getting a bit hazy on my knowledge here. But they tended to be phased out by Napoleonic times, although some armies kept them. We'll talk about those a bit at the end. So we're going to start off with the foot artillery, what Stalin was said to have called the God of War. Now, this is, as I said earlier, our heavy guns. They have a long range and they're very hard hitting. But how do we get the most out of them? Well, one of the first things that we'll see is their stat line. I'm talking about a full battery here. Some people use one gun for a battery. I prefer to use two. Your mileage may vary. It doesn't matter. If you're first starting out, I'd probably just use the one. But the stats for a full battery are 3, 2, 1 for shooting. So that's 3 at close range. That's up to 3 inches. 2 at medium range. That's up to half its range. And 1 at long range. In addition to only rolling 1 dice at long range, it also suffers -1 to hit. So fairly often, particularly in the early stages of a game, you will be rolling 1 dice and you'll need 6s to hit. So that's our first obvious thing there, is if you are defending, start as soon as you can, just keep pounding away. If you are attacking, 1 dice needing a 5 to hit, it's not great. Every 3 turns you get a hit. Not brilliant. So you really want to be looking at getting to within medium range when you're rolling 2 dice and you just need that regular 4 to hit. There's another advantage to being in medium range as well, and that is that the enemy's save modifier is at -2. So that means that even something like a French column with a 3+ save now drops to having only a 5 up. So that's really strong. At long range, it's only a -1. So, I mean, it's not the end of the world. It counteracts the +1 for being in column. So it's maybe not the end of the world. But there is you will see a huge damage improvement, multiplication, from going from long range to medium range. It's not just going to be twice as much because you find twice as many shots. You've also not got the -1 to hit. And you do have -2 to the enemy save. So try and get your guns in medium range. They only have to be half an inch inside medium range, and they get that firepower. Now, something that we don't use in our battle reports is grazing shots. So these are possible rules to use from the supplements. The reason we don't use them is I find that French or attacking armies in general, they need the support, and they already have a hard enough time as it is. So I don't want to punish them any further, because that'll make their attacks almost impossible. As we've seen in a lot of Napoleonic battles, the attacks were actually very successful. Austerlitz, I guess, would be the most obvious example of that. But it's worth pointing out, if you do play using the grazing fire rule, that will stop you having those dense columns. So it's something to bear in mind, and it means that you may, again, want to bring your artillery that little bit closer, just so you can get more columns into that grazing fire. I don't want to talk too much about it here. The rules in Clash of Eagles, so you can check it out for yourself there. So, how do we get our artillery in medium range, and how do we keep it safe? Well, the obvious thing to do here is to keep it safe with cavalry. Again, looking at the supplements, there is a special rule that allows your cavalry to make ready. That means that they can intercept any enemies that are wanting to charge. So they can make ready and they can charge the guys who are trying to charge your artillery. Now that said, your artillery is not completely defenseless if it gets charged. It's basically the only time it's ever going to use its short-range firepower. Or, it has happened in the past, but most of the time it's the only chance you can get to use it. So it's 3 dice, and you're going to be hitting on 3s because you're at close range. So you can cause quite a lot of damage. Remember, if you're being charged by a standard-sized, say, Hussar unit, they're going to be only stamina 3, so you're hitting on a 3. If you're lucky, you'll get 3 hits. They're now saving on a 6, So they're going to be lucky to ping any of those off. That charge becomes a failure. Assuming that you don't stop them, you may even disorder them. Now, don't get me wrong, disordered cavalry will probably beat artillery in melee, but it's better than nothing, I suppose. It's not ideal, though. Any artillery that loses a round of combat is destroyed. All the results on the artillery, in fact, I think it's the same for shooting as well, are that they are destroyed. So you really do not want to get them charged if you can at all help it. The other thing, of course, is just to do... I mean, I guess it's sort of like a reconnaissance by fire, but it's not. I guess it's defense by fire. That is, anyone who comes at you, you just blast them away so they can't charge you. You could have an infantry line battalion next to them. This would be particularly useful if they are a very good at shooting infantry battalion. Austrians with their large unit, they roll 4 dice. Brits with a first fire, anything like that, and they'll be really good at defending the artillery. Because artillery, well, foot artillery anyway, is very static, that's why it's important that you defend them in the best way possible. The enemy's going to know where they are, they're going to know where they are for a while, so they can concentrate and get their countermeasures in place. Something that's a lot more difficult with horse artillery, but we'll come on to those guys in a bit. So we've got our artillery in position now. It's at half range minus half an inch, and it's ready. It's well defended. It's got a regiment of cavalry on one side and a battalion of infantry defending it on the other, where it's all gravy. So what should be our prime targets? Well, there's different trains of thought on this, I would say. Mine initial thing would be try and get that first damage on as many units as possible. Remember, the first pip of damage can never be rallied off. So it's a hit that will stick. There's very little point in, you're firing at the enemy line, you're waiting around for 2 or 3 turns to soften them up before the assault goes in, and all they keep doing is rallying off that second or third hit that you do to them every turn. So rather than continuously pound the same target, you're much better off sprinkling a whiff of grape shot across the different enemy targets. Now, it should be said here that this is very historically inaccurate. This is not how artillery would or indeed do operate. The way they work is with saturation. You pick a spot and you keep firing at that spot. So if you don't want to do that because that's historically inaccurate, that's absolutely fine. I don't think I can criticize you for that. I would say that's fair enough. By the same token, if you do the thing that's most advantageous for your army, I can't criticize that either. There will be people out there who say, well, that's not historical. Well, it's a war game at the end of the day. So if you're not doing the best for your army, then, if my general wasn't doing the best for me, I'd have to question why I was following that general into battle, let's put it that way. And which of those targets should be our priority? Well, the first thing I always go for is the cavalry. Now, again, this is very historically inaccurate. Artillery did indeed fire at cavalry when caught in the open. Famously, Colonel Lepic of the Grenadier à Cheval said, "Those are bullets, not turds," when the Russian artillery were firing at them at the Battle of Eylau. So this does happen. However, cavalry caught in the open stationary by artillery fire are in a world of trouble. In fact, General Lasalle once stationed some of his troops directly in the enemy line of fire as punishment. I think he left them there for like half an hour and then ordered them to withdraw. So it's not a place that you wanted to be. So yes, that did happen. However, cavalry commanders, by and large, were very good at holding their cavalry either in dead ground, so that's ground that you can't see from the enemy's position, or behind or in a nap of the earth, effectively. Obviously, we play on tables, and they're a bit like billiard tables. They're nice and flat. So that's not really what terrain is like. So you could find divots and things like that to hide the cavalry in, and that's normally what they do. That's the skill of a cavalry commander. But, on our tabletop, we don't necessarily have that. So I would say that you want to go large on that cavalry. Now, the reason you want to take out the cavalry first is twofold. One, they are the biggest threat to your artillery. They are the guys who, if you're within medium range of them, then they're probably within charge range of you. So you've got to watch out for that. So you want to try and clip their wings as much as possible. If they've got 3 stamina, I'd quite fancy throwing them in against that artillery piece, assuming that they weren't well protected. If they've taken 1 casualty, it's 50-50 whether I actually manage to complete the charge. If I've got 2 casualties on them, there's absolutely no chance I'm going to complete that charge. So I think, that's why I would suggest that you take out the cavalry first. The second thing is, what are you using your artillery for? If you are in defense, you're using it to break up the enemy as they attack. Now, one of the great things that your opponent's cavalry will try and do to you is make you form square. That weakens your defense. So you want to try and stop them doing that, so you can have the maximum defense against the infantry as they come in. If you're in attack, then you know that the enemy's cavalry is going to try and blunt your attack by forcing you into square. For instance, when we went to the greatest game in Glasgow, the French centre absolutely smashed straight through the Allied centre. This is off to my right. Obviously, I was at Hougoumont, but off to the right, in between Hougoumont and Le Haye-Saint, the French just completely annihilated the British, or the Anglo-British, I should say. But the British cavalry used the heavy brigade brilliantly, and they forced I think it was the middle guard they were using, it might have been the young guard, but they forced them to form square, and that stopped the momentum of the attack. And that's really what cavalry can do. It didn't cause any casualties, because all the enemy were in square, but it stopped the momentum, and that was absolutely crucial to them stopping the breakthrough in the centre being exploited by the French cavalry commanders. Also, the complete ineptitude of French cavalry commanders. Still not over it. But no. Joking aside, the way artillery is used cavalry is used when you're in defence is to try and break up the enemy's attack. So if your artillery can stop the enemy cavalry from breaking up your attack, then that's why you can be so successful in putting your attack in. You're much better off stopping that enemy cavalry unit from forcing your column into square than you are maybe making that column a little bit more likely to win the combat, because chances are it ain't going to make combat. So always go for the cavalry first. Failing that, go for easy to hit infantry second. Infantry in squares are perfect for this. You get the +1 to hit, and that can be really strong. Now, I would suggest, if you are facing infantry in squares, it can be worth wheeling your guns up to point-blank range. That's one of the few times when I would recommend that you do. The only other one is if they're in buildings, because you know that the enemy isn't going to charge you, because they can't either shake out of square or charge out of a building, so you know that you should be pretty safe. Obviously, they're going to be firing back at you, but they're going to be having limited shots back at you. So it's one of those, you win some, you lose some. I'm not sure I'd recommend it, but I could understand if you decided to get into point-blank range with your cannons against a square. So we've eliminated all the enemy cavalry. We have blasted their squares. What's next? Any enemy infantry that are sort of, I guess I'd call them enemy plus. So what I mean by that is, if they've got a special rule that's going to make them more difficult to take. So the obvious example for that would be Highlanders. Because they've got Tough Fighter, it means that they're as good as a British infantry regiment plus Tough Fighter. By shooting them, you're doing exactly the same as if you shot at the line battalion next to them, but those guys are just that little bit more effective. Something that I might advise against, however, is shooting those elite enemies that have better saves and or the elite special rule. When your artillery hits, you want to make sure those hits go through. If you're firing at, say, the old guard in column, they've got a 2+ save. All right, it drops to a 4+. That's fine. But they're still going to save half of your artillery shots. If you fire that column next to them, then they're only saving a third of your artillery shots. And that's something I should have mentioned about the cavalry as well. You're much better off going for light or medium cavalry with a 4+ save than you are heavy cavalry, cuirassiers, etc. I know that sounds counterintuitive, and again, it is quite ahistorical. So if you choose to go for the heavy cavalry, then that's fine as well. But you've gone to the effort of hitting the enemy, you want to make sure that those hits stick. Remember, if you're attacking a small unit of, chasseurs à cheval, is just as effective at making your unit have to form square than a large unit of cuirassiers. So the quality of the troops doesn't necessarily matter, but their presence is what's important. So you want to try and limit that as much as possible. Those enemy units that have got extra stamina, extra morale saves, and or elite, they're not great targets for your artillery. And that leads us on to the other great thing about artillery, and that's trying to disorder the enemy. So if you can get the enemy disordered, then they become doubly less effective against you. They A, can't move, so they can't attack, and they B, get -1 to hit from shooting in close combat, so they can't really fight you either. It can be really strong, and it's good if you've managed to isolate an enemy unit. It means if they fall back, then they are double disordered, and it means that it takes them 2 turns to get back into the fight. You've taken that battalion out of the game for maybe 20% of the game if you're playing 10 turns. So just to quickly summarise for the foot artillery, start at long range, but if you can, try and get in medium range as soon as possible. Your target selection, I think, should be first of all cavalry, then infantry that provide fine targets, squares, etc. Then line plus, so things like Highlanders or perhaps converged grenadiers, although they do have the elite special rule, something like that. And then the other units, just line units, etc. I don't necessarily think that those units with elite, although I did just mention combined grenadiers, are necessarily the best targets. Neither, I don't think, are heavy cavalry. You want to try and make those hits stick. So that's it for foot artillery. Now let's talk about horse artillery, because it serves a very different purpose. Because horse artillery can unlimber and fire in the same turn, unlike foot artillery. So that instantly means that your artillery is going to be more manoeuvrable than that of the foot. And that's about right, because it should be there to keep up with the cavalry and provide them some fire support. Now, we've talked in a couple of videos on the how to use French cavalry and how to use British cavalry, about maybe softening up the enemy cavalry with artillery first, and that's again exactly what I would recommend here. Similarly to the foot artillery, you really want to try and shave off 1 or 2 stamina from the enemy cavalry, because, so it's slightly different here, and it's because you are so well matched. Because you're going to be charging, probably the enemy's going to be counter-charging, so you're going to be hitting each other on 3s with the usually the same save, then you need to get that extra, that little extra that helps you out. So that extra point of damage before the charge goes in can be really, really useful. So horse artillery, I recommend that you target the enemy cavalry with it first, and to be fair, that's also historically the best way of using it as well. What you're looking for in your horse artillery is to get that edge. If you've got 3 stamina, your opponent's only got 2, then you can afford to take 1 more damage than the opponent. But if the combat's a draw, then if you've taken 2 each, he's testing and you're not. So it's just about getting that extra half a pip of edge that's going to be really useful for you. Again, alternatively, what you can do is you can use it to disorder, or, disorder not really, but you can perhaps use it to shake an enemy unit, which means that when the opponent charges or counter-charges, they're not being supported anymore. Because of the distance that cavalry move, it means that a unit that gets left behind is quite a lot further behind. And remember, those command distances aren't any longer for cavalry commanders than they are infantry commanders. So unless they've got Marauder, suddenly the opponent has to either make 2 individual orders, or they're looking at perhaps having a -1 modifier. The other way of using them, of course, is to exploit the ability of the cavalry to force the enemy infantry into squares. So you've got your cavalry, they declare a charge on the enemy, they successfully form square. You've got the artillery in place right there on the spot, ready to start opening fire on them. Similarly, you may also be able to use its speed to get around the flank of the enemy and start getting some enfilade shots on them. Suddenly, hitting on 4s with 2 dice is a lot better when you're re-rolling the misses. If you can get in point blank range, that's going to be really, really brutal. It used to be double dice if you enfiladed. I did once have a battalion enfiladed by some artillery, and the 6 dice that they rolled, it was absolutely disgusting because they were hitting on 3s as well. So yes, no, I can highly recommend against having that done to you. let's put it that way. And that's another use for horse artillery, is to combat the enemy horse artillery. Limbered artillery are a really, really easy target to hit, unlimbered artillery less so, but if you can take them out, then that helps you get that local advantage, lets you get that edge. As you know, at heart I'm an infantryman, so I always like to think of horse artillery being a little bit like a suppressing fire machine gun that suppresses the enemy as the attack goes in. Obviously it's not a machine gun, but it has a very similar effect, or it should do anyway, if you're getting the most out of your horse artillery. The fact that it's got a shorter range shouldn't hugely matter because you've got that increased manoeuvrability, but it does also mean that it's a lot easier to get caught out and destroyed, so you need to watch out for that. You need to guard them well. My suggestion would be, if you've got, for argument's sake, a brigade of 3 units, that you leave 1 unit behind just to babysit the artillery, You can always throw them in if you need to, and it just helps you have that reserve as well. But they should never be too far from the rest of the brigade anyway, because the artillery is there to support the brigade. Something that you can also do is throw that artillery out. This is a sacrificial move. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but throw it out there. Let it shoot at the enemy as they charge. Then they get destroyed in combat, but that enemy is usually weakened by the shots, and the remainder of your cavalry brigade can then go in and absolutely clean house. One of the things to remember with both types of artillery, though, is they are effectively dead points when it comes to your brigade. They are points which are not counting towards brigade strength, and that's whether they're alive or dead. So it doesn't increase the number of units in your brigade. If you spend too many points on artillery, your brigades are going to be quite weak and they're going to be vulnerable to breaking. So just be aware of that. You don't want too much artillery. Now, I said at the beginning I'd quickly touch on infantry battalion guns. So these are fairly rare in Black Powder. A Clash of Eagles brought them more to the fore. Certainly the Prussians have them, and I believe the Poles do as well. Now, these are small guns, 3-pounders usually, and were historically crewed by members of the Grenadier Company. They add an extra dice to your shooting. They're okay. They do, however, have a huge downside, which is they slow you down. Now, if you are a Prussian, I don't think that's necessarily too bad. If you are a Pole, it is awful. You need to use your high command values and your march attack column, your attack columns, not march attack column, your attack columns to close at the enemy as quickly as possible. Those guns are just going to slow you down, as they did historically. That's why most infantry formations got rid of their guns long before the key years of the Napoleonic Wars. Some of them, alright, say the Prussians had them in 1806, and how did that end for them? So they add an extra little bit of firepower to your unit, but if you're French, you do not want to be firing at the enemy anyway. Watch my how to use a French video on that, and the Poles even more so because they have tough fighter versus Russians. So if you are fighting your historical opponent, the Russians, then they absolutely want to be closing in. Remember, everyone, the bullet is a fool, the bayonet is a hero, as the Russians would say. There's one final thing I want to touch on here, and that is grand batteries. Now, there are no rules in Black Powder for grand batteries. I believe this is an absolutely massive oversight of the rules. Okay, you could say, well, in later battles, certainly in the Peninsula, grand batteries weren't a thing. And, that's true. You're looking really for grand batteries at places like Leipzig or, places like that. But I think possibly the most famous grand battery of all time was at Waterloo. So why there's not rules for them in there, I don't really know, I'm afraid. There certainly should be, and for me, it would be that you either roll an extra dice, or you don't suffer the -1, or you just have a round of shooting before the game starts. Something like that is how I would do it. But there aren't rules for that at the moment, but just bear in mind that there may be in the future, and if you're French in particular, it might be worth looking at organising your grand batteries that way. I'm going to do a video in the future about suggested rules for the 1809 campaign. I may also do one for the 1805 campaign. So anyone with any thoughts on either of those, please get in touch, and I'll add them to the video if I think that they're, that they would add something to the period. I'm sure they will do. I don't want to leave this video on a downer, so I just want to talk about how we represent our batteries on the table. I mentioned it very briefly earlier on. In the rules, one gun equals one battery. Now, the frontage of those guns is, I think it's 50mm. I've recently changed to have mine 75mm wide, and I use 2 guns per battery, which gives quite a large footprint for the unit, and I think that's quite good. Now, the other thing is limbers. A lot of people I see online say, do I need limbers? Now, the answer is no, you don't need limbers. For me, and this is something that I've done, so I now have 2 limbers for every battery in my army, so I've got a lot of limbers. But for me, they're very much for the gamer who has everything. Now, I'm not saying I have everything, but I have everything I need, really. It's I want to buy something for my Napoleonic army. I don't want to buy more line infantry. I don't want to buy more chasseurs or more hussars. What can I buy? A limber's a perfect buy for that. Something that I find it really good for is as a present, and I know that sounds really silly, but if your partner or kids or whatever says to you, I know it's your birthday coming up or it's Christmas or whatever, I don't know what to buy you, go and get something from the Wargaming show or order something online and I'll give you the money for it. A limber can be a really nice thing for that because it's something a little bit different. If you say, oh, well, I want another battalion of infantry, they're just another battalion of infantry. But if you get the limbers, something like that, it's a nice little piece, it's a nice little vignette in of itself. And that's something else as well with artillery, is they make beautiful little vignettes. I bought one recently from a Russian company, and you've got the guy, he's got his thumb over the touch hole to stop any sparks coming through from when you ram the sponge in, and it's just a little second, and it's just a beautiful little vignette. So that's something that artillery are really nice for, and the limbers add that little bit extra to you as well. So that's a very quick, brief rundown of how to use artillery and black powder. There's some stuff in there that's historically accurate, and that's the way the rules work. There's some in there that's historically inaccurate, but it works best under these rules. That's a quirk with the black powder rules. All rules are going to have situations where to do the ahistorical thing is to do the best thing, and it's up to you and your gaming friends to decide which approach you want to take. But thank you very much for watching. Please, please, please like and share the video if you enjoyed this content. I don't know what happened in the sort of last 2-3 months, but YouTube algorithm seems to have changed, and the number of subscribers I'm getting has dropped off a little bit, so I'm not quite sure what's going on there. But if you did enjoy the video, please like it, maybe share it amongst your club mates. I want to say thank you to the members who've joined the channel as well. There's a little button next to it there, and their donations really help to keep me going. In fact, I've used this month's donations to buy a new stand for my camera, so when I'm doing the battle reports, which hopefully we'll go back to this month, then it'll be much better there. But thank you very much for watching. Also, please remember that if you're watching this when it goes out on Sunday the 30th of May, we are doing another live stream tomorrow. It's a bank holiday here in the UK. I also believe it's a bank holiday in the States as well. So if you're up in the wee small hours at 10:30 British summer time, I'll be doing a live stream, and we'll just be carrying on the road to Waterloo. And I've decided to call it the Road to Waterloo, Iowa, because I'm also doing some American troops out of that set as well. And there is a town called Waterloo in Iowa, apparently. I might have to visit it one day. But thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you tomorrow, but if not, I'll see you next time.